Hello everyone, my name is Will Williams, and today I'll be presenting a paper that is designed to complicate our understanding of enslavement in East Jersey in the 18th and 19th centuries. Prominent in this presentation is an area in Bergen County, New Jersey, known as Dunkerhook, and the white slave-owning family, the Zabriskis, who farmed there. From this corner of rural East Jersey rose a free African-American community who persisted there until the early 20th century. I will be discussing evidence that suggests generational, shared, or collective ownership and rented labor of enslaved African Americans was used to socially and economically reinforce the position of white families. With this form of exploitation, it's possible that numbers of enslaved people in parts of New Jersey are underrepresented. Using historical documents from the Church of Paramus and tax and will data from the period between 1780 to 1820, I will present a socioeconomic model used by white families to extract labor from enslaved African Americans. The rise of a free community in Dunkerhook, it can be understood as an act of social opposition and as a result of the oppression from the surrounding white society. In this small part of East Jersey, an area that was of high and persisting slavery, a community of African Americans found allies and refuge. There are several origin stories to the first Zabriskie who colonized the Dunkerhook area. One common story has Albert Zabriskie, an immigrant of Polish origin, set sail from Amsterdam in May 1662 on a ship called the Fox. It arrived off Sandy Hook on August 31st, 1662, and he was one of the area's largest landowners after he procured a 2,100-acre tract of land. This land was acquired by means of collecting on a Native American debt for a different tract of land occupied by a different tribe of Native Americans. This fact reminds us the foundations of settler colonialism that are rooted in dispossession. Subsequent divisions by inheritance saw Andreas Zabriskie as the landowner until 1819 and farming the nearby land on the east side of Paramus Road. Christian A. Zabriskie, a possible wampum merchant, operated from 263 and 273 Dunkerhook Road. He died in 1813, 6 years before his father. Like many other rural northern families, the Zabriskies were farmers, cultivating between 100 to 170 acres, an area slightly larger than typical northern farms. Following Andreas Zabriskie's death in 1819, Cornelius C. Zabriskie inherited the property. This period is out of this study's scope, but it's worth discussing here because in the following decade, around 1830, we see in the census records the first sign of the community critical to this study, a free, emancipated African American community. It's possible some members of the community were formerly enslaved by the Zabriskies. The name Sam is mentioned in the manumission records as being freed by Cornelius Zabriskie. Coincidentally, the 1855 census mentions a Samuel Bennett living along Dunkerhook Road. Could these two names belong to the same individual? Dunkerhook Road is now nested within the Saddle River County Park system, located in North New Jersey in Bergen County. The road runs perpendicular to the north-south orientated Paramus Road, connecting Ridgewood in the north and Arcola in the south. Both of the 17th and 18th century Zabriskie-built homes that later became part of the free African American community survived until 2012, when in the middle of the night a developer tore down 273 Dunkerhook Road to make way for a modern McMansion. This study is built around a framework making use of two complementing data types. The first, what I've labeled as the official record, incorporates historical documents such as wills, census, and tax records, allowing us to build a model of the Zabriskis' farm dealings and provide an empirical backdrop to the capital and wealth of the Zabriskis. The second, what I term as the social record, makes use of church membership data. This information comes from the Church of Paramus. In 1859, the records from the colonial and early Republic periods were compiled into a history of the church. Amongst this information were the membership records for the Dutch families, and included in this data were the first names of enslaved persons, who they were enslaved by, and the dates that they attended the church. The presence of enslaved African Americans in white churches during the period covered by this study is rare. Both the English and Dutch feared baptisms would lead to emancipation. In Dutch communities, racism, attitudes of white supremacy, and the spiritual condition of the enslaved also rationalized the exclusion of slaves. Elting, the pastor of the Church of Paramus from 1799 to 1850, petitioned for the inclusion of African Americans in the church, a move resulting in internal church conflict. However, there were limits to his progressiveness, as he was also the enslaver of two individuals named Phoebe and Sire in 1802. When we consider white society's attitudes towards slavery and racism during this period, this document gains historical significance. So this map gives a little context of how Church of Paramus relates to Dunkerhook. To the south, at the bottom of the map, we see Dunkerhook Road. Across the river from Dunkerhook, we see the Zabriskis farm, and in the north is the Church of Paramus at the top of the map. And the distance between these two areas is about 4 miles. That's along Paramus Road. And the Church of Paramus, it served about 300 white families when it was rebuilt around 1801, and its constituents came from a wide area in northern New Jersey. The yearly cost of a pew was between $4 and $52. The closer one was to the pulpit, the greater the social standing of the individual. African Americans attending the church were relegated to the galleries, a position as far away from the head of power as you can get, and we can infer that this was a way of reinforcing social stratigraphy. Andreas Zabrinski's 1779 to 1802 tax records show the scale of the Zabriskis' agriculture was larger than average, which was typically 58.3 acres in the northern states at the time. In 1780, he was recorded as owning 170 acres of improved land and 2 slaves. By 1784, his holdings appeared to have diminished. Tax records show a reduction to 100 acres and a slightly fluctuating number of slaves. In most years post-1784, only 1 slave was recorded, and on 5 occasions, none were reported. However, there is also a 5-year gap in the tax records that the social record from the Church of Paramus can illuminate. Andreas's activities appear to become more complex when we situate them against the social record. In the 5-year gap of the official record, we have data for enslaved persons covering the years of 1800 and 1801. Data for Susan's enslavement, represented here at the top of this network diagram, shows that she was enslaved by 3 individuals between the years of 1801 to 1803. Her first recording in 1801 shows Andreas Zabrinski as her enslaver. The following year, her name is associated with an A.B. Westervelt, and lastly, in 1803, she is listed as being enslaved by Leah Terhune. We can connect Andreas Zabriskie with A.B. Westervelt and Leah Terhune through church business and genealogical records. Westervelt and Andreas's father, Christian A. Zabriskie, were responsible for negotiating a land lease in 1803 for the church. Leah Terhune, née Zabriskie, was the niece of Andreas. Her father, Heinrich C. Zabriskie, farmed about a mile south of Andreas. These close relationships could be indicative of an exploitive system sharing Susan's labor. Noted here is an anomaly in 1801 of 3 additional enslaved persons in Andreas's record over typical years. Looking at the total farmable acres and the total farm holdings between 1797 and 1802, we notice there is no increase warranting the need for more labor. It's possible that Andreas rented the labor for a short duration. The original 1735 church was demolished in April or May 1800, and the new church was completed in September. The appearance in 1801 of 3 additional bondsmen may be attributed to a portion of the church's construction, or perhaps the rectory or the administrative buildings. The manufacturing and commerce economies of the northern states contributed to the diversification of skills amongst the enslaved. Paramus Church's historical records attribute much of the labor used in the church's 1800 construction to derive from local artisans and carpenters. Duke, Han, and Pete could well have been Andreas's contribution, an act that had benefited his social position. Looking elsewhere in the data, we find 3 names, Tom, Jin, and Phyllis, 3 enslaved people whose patterns of enslavement have similarities with Susan. Jin's name appears between 1800 and 1803, and in each of the years 3 years recorded, her name is associated with two different enslavers. Likewise, Tom is mentioned twice in 1799 as a person enslaved by Albert Terhune and Benjamin Zabriskie. Following a 4-year gap, a similar pattern to Jin emerges. Tom is again enslaved by two individuals of the same family, J. Banter and Jacob Banter. Likewise, Phyllis first appears in 1800 and again in 1801 in connection with Anita Bogart and John Bogart, who are husband and wife. This specific connection has been identified as a result of a death of John and his wife's inheritance. The relationship data previously shown, and here represented in a relationship diagram, reinforces my argument that not all enslaved individuals were owned by the people that they were forced to work for. Some were possibly rented labor brought in to fulfill a specific or seasonal labor requirement, or their bodies and labor that were collectively owned or shared within the white community. In the case of Phyllis's enslavement, we see how the lives of those in bondage become capital, maintaining their captors' families' economic status. The inter-family renting, sharing, or group ownership of African Americans in the New Barbados Township reinforced white society's economic and racially defined status, while also surveilling and controlling the movement of African Americans. This form of slavery embedded bondsmen within the economy and the white community. The enslaved were familiar with the labor requirements of the white families because of their interactions and their sought-after skills. As slavery slowly wound down in New Jersey, the so-called free, they were still bound by the economics of their situation. Shared circumstance and interaction with other households, it brought African Americans into closer contact. These factors contributed to relatively stable relationships. After emancipation, living near your allies provided protection and security from surrounding racism. What is not discussed in this study are the struggles enslaved peoples and African Americans faced and their methods of resistance. Instead, what I hope has been presented is a story of resilience against a market-based system renting and exploiting bodies, skills, and labor. To wrestle away a piece of land, if only temporarily, from the dominant group and sustain themselves on the island until the 20th century is something that should be celebrated. Thank you for listening.